For 3 years, my brother told me the same thing every time I asked. Sarah, there's nothing left. Papa's business had debts we didn't even know about when he died. I've been handling it all on my own. I believed him. I had no reason not to. Until one quiet afternoon, at Nani's house, she reached into the almirah beside her bed and placed a small diary on the table between us. My father's handwriting on the cover. And on the very first page, in faded ink, a number I had never heard before. This is everything that happened next, and I am going to tell you every part of it from the very beginning, because the small moments matter just as much as the final one. My name is Sarah, and I grew up in Kanpur in a household that was, by any ordinary measure, a functional and reasonably happy one. My father ran a small textile trading business. Nothing grand, nothing that would have made headlines, but something that had fed and housed and educated us for as long as I could remember. My mother looked after the house. My brother Vikram was 6 years older than me, and the 4 of us, plus occasional long visits from my maternal grandmother, my Nani, made up the total circumference of my world for most of my childhood. I want to tell you something about my father before I tell you the rest of this story, because everything that happened afterward makes considerably more sense if you understand the kind of man he was. He was not a particularly demonstrative person. He didn't say, "I love you," the way some fathers do, didn't produce grand gestures or surprise gifts or speeches on birthdays. What he did was quieter than that, and in retrospect, more consistent. He showed up. Every single time. School plays, examination results, small achievements I had already forgotten by the time I became an adult. He was there, watching carefully, saying little but clearly, unmistakably present. He had a habit of writing things down, which I knew even as a child. Small notebooks he kept in the chest pocket of his kurta, where he jotted accounts and figures, and occasionally, I noticed once or twice, small personal notes to himself in a handwriting so small it was almost illegible to anyone else. He died when I was 22. A heart attack. Sudden and without the kind of warning that would have allowed any of us to prepare properly. I was in my final year of college. Vikram, by then 28, had been working in Papa's business for 3 years, handling the logistics side of it while Papa managed client relationships and finances. It felt natural, in the stunned, disoriented weeks after the funeral, to allow Vikram to step into the role of managing everything. He was the older one. He had been in the business already. I was still finishing my degree, in no position to understand balance sheets or supplier contracts or any of the complicated machinery of a trading operation that had been running, in one form or another, for 20 years. So I trusted him completely. The way you trust a sibling when you are young and grieving and have no particular reason yet to do anything else. The first time I asked about Papa's finances was about 4 months after he passed, when I had a practical question about whether I could continue my education beyond the undergraduate degree, whether a postgraduate course was financially realistic, or whether I needed to start working immediately and contribute to the household. Vikram sat with me at the kitchen table and explained, patiently and in some detail, that the business was carrying significant debt that he was still in the process of understanding fully, that Papa had borrowed against certain assets to expand the operation 2 years earlier, and that the expansion hadn't quite delivered the returns he had hoped for, that things were, in Vikram's exact words, tight for a while until I sorted all out properly. I asked, fairly directly, whether Papa had left any savings, any personal account that wasn't tied to the business debt. Vikram said no. He said it without hesitation, without any visible discomfort. He said Papa had put most of his personal savings back into the business over the last 2 years, chasing the expansion that ultimately hadn't worked out the way he'd planned. That there was no separate fund, no personal savings account sitting somewhere quietly untouched. Just the business, the debt, and the long process of bringing it back to a stable position. I believed him. I went back to my room and adjusted my plans accordingly. The way you adjust when you trust someone's account of your situation completely. I decided I would finish the undergraduate degree and then work. There would be no postgraduate program, not yet. Maybe later, once things had stabilized, once Vikram had sorted out the business finances he was managing so carefully on all of our behalf. I asked again, roughly a year later, when a friend of mine mentioned casually that she had just received a small inheritance from her grandfather and was investing it. The mention of inheritance made something shift quietly in the back of my mind, some half-formed thought I hadn't fully articulated to myself yet. I asked Vikram again, this time more specifically, not about the business, but about Papa personally. Had he truly left nothing at all outside the business? No savings account, no fixed deposit, nothing held separately from the trading operation? Vikram said the same thing he had said the first time, in slightly different words. Papa had been too focused on the business expansion to maintain significant personal savings. Everything had gone in. There was nothing separate to speak of, and I believed him again, because he was my brother. because he had been in the business with Papa and understood its finances in ways I simply didn't. Because there was no specific reason, no single concrete detail that contradicted what he was telling me. What I didn't know, and had no way of knowing at the time, was this. My father, during the last 2 years of his life, had done something careful and deliberate and entirely without my knowledge. He had opened a fixed deposit account, a separate, personal account, completely distinct from the business finances, in a private bank in the city. He had been putting money into it steadily, not enormous amounts in any single month, but consistently, over 2 years, whenever the business allowed a small surplus. By the time he died, there was a substantial sum in that account, and the account had a nominee, a single nominee, named specifically and in writing at the time the account was opened. That nominee was me. I didn't know any of this. For 3 years, I had no idea it existed. The only person who knew, other than my father himself, was my Nani. I want to tell you about Nani now, because she matters enormously to this story, and I don't want to describe her only in terms of what she eventually did. She deserves more than that. Her name was Mira, though I had called her Nani my entire life, and it felt strange to think of her as anything else. She was 76 that year, sharp and physically healthy in the particular way some elderly people are, as though their bodies have simply decided to cooperate for longer than expected. She lived alone in a 2-room house in the older part of the city, about 40 minutes by auto from where I was then renting a small flat near my office. I visited her every few weeks, sometimes more often, because she was easy company. She didn't ask too many questions. She made excellent chai, and she had a habit of saying things that stayed with you for days afterward without you quite being able to explain why. She had adored my father in the quiet, measured way she showed affection to anyone she loved. Not with a great deal of visible sentiment, but with consistent, unhurried attention. After he died, she had been one of the few people who seemed to grieve him clearly, without performance, without the exhausting social choreography that surrounds death in large families. She simply missed him. She said so, plainly, when I asked her once, on one of my visits. I miss him the way you miss someone who is always reliable. It's a very particular kind of missing. She had known about the account because my father had told her. He had told her, he explained in the brief conversation she later described to me, because he wanted someone outside the immediate household to know. Someone who would still be there after he was gone. Someone who would remember and act on it if necessary. He gave her the diary as a kind of record, a plain notebook containing the account number, the bank's name and branch, the amount at the time of their conversation, and a short note in his own hand explaining why he had opened the account and who it was for. He told her to keep it safely and to use her own judgment about when and whether to bring it into the open. For 3 years, she had kept it safely, and she had watched, and she had used her judgment. I was at her house on a Wednesday afternoon in early November. Nothing unusual had brought me there that day. I had a half day at work, I hadn't visited in about 3 weeks, and I simply wanted to see her. We had been sitting together for about an hour, talking about small things. Her plants, my work, a neighbor of hers whose daughter had just gotten married. When she set down her chai glass, looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read, and said, very quietly, "Sarah, I need to show you something. I should have shown you earlier, and I'm sorry I waited this long." I was trying to understand the right moment, and I think I've been too patient. She got up from the cot, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees required respect, and went to the almirah on the far side of the room. She opened the lower drawer, moved aside several folded saris, and retrieved a small, plain notebook. She brought it to the table between us and set it down without opening it first. She sat down again. She said, "This is your father's. He gave it to me before he died. Not long before, a few months, when he was starting to feel that something wasn't entirely right with his health, though neither of us said that directly. He asked me to keep it, and to make sure you got what was inside it if anything happened to him." I looked at the notebook. My father's handwriting on the cover, small and dense and completely recognizable. My hands were not entirely steady when I picked it up. On the first page, in ink that had faded slightly at the edges, there was an account number, a bank name and branch, a date, and a figure that stopped my breath for a moment when I read it. 42 lakh rupees. Below the figure, in my father's careful handwriting, a single sentence, for Sarah, for her future, not for anything else. I sat there for a long time without speaking. Nani did not rush me. She refilled my chai, set it beside me, and simply waited, the way she always waited, without impatience, without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. When I finally looked up, I said, and my voice was much smaller and less steady than I would have wanted, "Nani, Vikram told me there was nothing. He told me multiple times. He said Papa had put everything into the business, that there was no personal savings, nothing left over. She said, very evenly, I know what Vikram told you. That is why I am showing you this now. She paused for a moment, then added, in the same quiet voice, I should have shown it sooner. I wanted to give him time to do the right thing on his own. I kept waiting for him to tell you himself. I was wrong to wait as long as I did, and I am sorry for that, Sarah, genuinely. That is partly my failure too. Friends, Agar Yekahani Apko Anderse Kutch Vilkara Rahi Hay. Agar Apni Pai Kapima Sus Kia Haiki Garki Logan Ne Apki Sath Wo Nahia Johona Chahayada. To please his video ko like Kareen. Our Agar Apchat Hainki AC Sachi. Dilko Chun Wali Kahanyan Aptak Pohanchti Rahain. To channel ko Abhi subscribe Zarur Kareen. Comment main Zarur like ye. Kia Apki Gar main Pai Kapi Kisi Bad Ne Apki Li. Wo Kia Jo Apkad Nahi Karpara Heda. Main Har comment Dayan Se Patihun. Abage Sunye. Jab Vikram Ko Patachala. I went home that evening with the diary in my bag, barely remembering the auto ride, barely registering the evening traffic or the calls I had missed during the hours I had sat at Nani's house, trying to understand what I had just learned. I sat alone in my flat for a long time. I read the diary through, 3 times, looking for anything I might have misunderstood. There was nothing to misunderstand. The account number was clear. The figure was clear. My father's note was clear. The account had been opened in my name as the sole nominee, which meant, legally, that upon his death, it was mine. It had been mine for 3 years. And for 3 years, someone had either known about it and said nothing, or had known about it and actively redirected it. The next morning, I called the bank. The account existed. The branch manager, once I had provided my identification and the account details from the diary, confirmed that the account had been opened in my father's name with me as the nominee, and that there had been activity on the account after my father's death. Significant activity. The fixed deposit had matured, been renewed once, and then, approximately 18 months after my father died, had been partially liquidated. A large amount withdrawn, with documentation that included a signature and a copy of an ID. Not mine. The bank manager was careful, professional, and clearly uncomfortable. He told me I would need to speak with the bank's legal department about the nomination process and what had occurred. He told me there were processes for this kind of situation. He told me, very gently, that I should not come to any conclusions on my own before speaking with a lawyer. I thanked him and ended the call and sat very still in my office chair for several minutes. Then I called Vikram. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice easy and ordinary. I said, Vikram, I need to talk to you about something. About Papa's bank account. The fixed deposit at the private bank in Swarup Nagar. There was a pause. Not a long one, not dramatic. Just one beat too long. One small, telling silence. Then he said, what are you talking about? And I knew, in that exact moment, with complete certainty, that he knew precisely what I was talking about. I said, I think we need to have this conversation in person. He came over that evening. He looked, when I opened the door, like someone who had spent the intervening hours constructing and discarding several different versions of something he was planning to say. He sat down. I placed the diary on the table between us, open to the first page. I placed the printout of my phone call notes beside it. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just let him look. His face did something I had never seen it do before. Not an immediate, obvious collapse. Vikram was not someone who fell apart dramatically, but a kind of gradual, quiet rearrangement. The careful expression he had brought in with him slowly becoming something else, something smaller and much less certain of itself. He said, finally, not looking at me, I was going to tell you. I said, when? He didn't answer that. I said, Vikram, you looked me in the eye and told me Papa left nothing. Twice. More than twice, actually, if I count every time I asked. You told me there was no personal savings, nothing separate from the business. I adjusted my entire life based on what you told me. I didn't apply for the course I wanted. I took a job I didn't choose because I thought it was the only option. I made every single decision I've made for 3 years based on a version of my situation that you knew was false. He sat quietly for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and much less controlled than it usually was. He said, I told myself it was temporary, that I was borrowing it, not taking it, that I would put it back before it was relevant, before you were in a position where you actually needed it. The business needed the capital. You weren't even thinking about inheritance at the time. You were just finishing college. I said, very calmly, more calmly than I actually felt, it was mine, Vikram. From the day Papa died, it was legally mine. You knew that, and you used it anyway, and you lied to me about its existence for 3 years. Not once, repeatedly, each time I asked. He had no answer to that. His face, which had slowly been losing its careful, constructed quality over the course of our conversation, was now simply tired and pale, and something I had never expected to see on my brother's face. Genuinely, completely ashamed. In the weeks that followed, with the help of a lawyer, Nani helped me find a practical, no-nonsense woman who had handled property disputes for 30 years and who listened to the full account of what had happened with a thoroughness that was oddly comforting. The situation was formally addressed. Vikram provided a complete accounting of what had been withdrawn from the account, when, and for what purpose. Most of it had gone into the business. Genuine business expenses, not personal spending, which was, I suppose, a distinction that mattered to him, even if it changed very little about what he had done. A portion remained in the account, untouched. A repayment plan was established for the remainder, formalized in writing, witnessed and documented by the lawyer. My father's bank acknowledged what had occurred, and the process of formally transferring the account into my name, as the legal nominee, as had always been the case, was completed. The money that remained was mine. The repayment arrangement ensured the rest would follow, over time. Vikram apologized. He did it properly. Not in the deflective, excuse-filled way people sometimes apologize when they want to end a difficult conversation more quickly, but in the measured, uncomfortable way of someone who has sat with the full weight of what they did and no longer has a way to make it feel smaller or more justified. He said he had convinced himself, in real time, that he was solving a short-term business problem with a temporary solution, and that at some undefined point in the future, he would correct it before it cost me anything real. He said he understood now that this kind of reasoning, deciding on someone else's behalf when they should need what was already theirs, was not a minor failing or a pragmatic decision. It was a betrayal. He used that word himself. I told him I heard him. I told him I appreciated that he had said it directly. I told him, honestly, that I didn't know yet how long it would take for things between us to feel normal again. And that I thought it was important to say that clearly, rather than reassure him that everything was already fine, because it wasn't yet. He accepted that without pushing back. I think it was the most honest moment we had ever had with each other as adults. With the money, I did something that felt. And I mean this simply, without drama, like honoring the note my father had written in that diary. He had written for her future, not for anything in particular, not with conditions or instructions, just for her future. I applied for the postgraduate program I had put aside 3 years earlier, the one I had quietly, privately decided I couldn't afford, and had stopped allowing myself to think about because it hurt too much to want something I had convinced myself was out of reach. I was accepted. I started the following semester. Before I left for the program, I spent an evening at Nani's house, sitting in the same room where she had handed me the diary, drinking chai, the plants she tended on the narrow window ledge catching the last of the evening light. She asked how everything had gone, and I told her most of it. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened. When I finished, she said something I have thought about often since then. She said, "Your father used to say that the best way to keep a promise to someone was to make sure a third person knew about it. He said promises that exist only between two people are the easiest ones to quietly unmake." I asked her when he had said that. She said, the same evening he gave me the diary. I've thought about that a great deal, about how clearly my father had understood something, even then, that he was not only opening an account and naming a nominee, he was building a small, quiet safeguard for the version of events he wanted to survive him. He had known, on some level, that words could be softened and facts could be reframed, and a grieving 22-year-old could be told, gently and repeatedly, that there was nothing left. So he had given the truth to someone who would keep it, and had trusted her to know when the right moment to bring it out had finally arrived. Nani had waited, and then she had decided. And she had been right about both things, the waiting and the deciding. I don't think what Vikram did was done out of malice. Not exactly. I have thought about it enough times from enough angles to believe that it was, at its core, a failure of the imagination, an inability or a refusal to fully think through what it actually meant to take from someone quietly, without their knowledge, something that had never belonged to him. It is easier to do that kind of thing when you don't look at it too directly, when you keep it in the peripheral vision of your conscience, where it stays vague enough to live with. But it cost me things I cannot get back. 3 years of decisions made on false ground. The specific, particular grief of being told by your own family that your father left you nothing, when in fact he had thought of you carefully enough to set something aside, had gone to the specific effort of keeping it separate and protected and clearly labeled with your name. There is a pain in that particular misrepresentation that is difficult to describe, because it is not only about the money. It is about being told, falsely and repeatedly, that you were thought about less than you actually were. When the truth came out, it did not come from a confrontation I engineered, or from a dramatic moment I had planned or forced. It came from a 76-year-old woman who had been watching quietly for 3 years, waiting for the right moment, holding onto a small diary and an almirah behind her saris. It came from one afternoon of chai and a question she asked herself, not out loud, not to anyone else, about whether she had waited long enough. If this story touched you in some way, if you know how it feels when someone close to you keeps you in the dark, when the truth was only with one person and that one person remained silent, then please do leave a comment. I genuinely read one comment at a time. Be sure to like this video if you think Nani was right, that someone should have spoken up. Subscribe to the channel. Every week I bring you true, heart-wrenching stories for all those who sometimes feel like no one is listening. Keep the notification bell on so you don't miss the next story. I'll see you very soon with the next one. For 3 years, my brother told